you're so lucky here. Oh my gosh.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Jenny Tricano-Muller. I'm the Vice Chair of the Douglas County Heritage Conservation Council. And the relationship between people and place has been a thread throughout my career. I am currently at the Nature Conservancy. I worked at National Geographic magazine before this. And I'm really excited to introduce you to our panel for the Land and Heritage session. Each of these three people on our panel are doing work that challenges us to expand how we think about heritage work. Whose heritage we bring with us into the future, how we start to repair harm done by past preservation work, and what the future of land and heritage can look like in our communities and county. First we'll have each panelist do a short presentation about their projects, and then we'll have some time for a discussion and maybe questions from you all. Dr. Araceli Masterson-Algar is an associate professor at the Department of American Studies at University of Kansas, where she focuses her research on human mobility, urban cultural studies, and social movements, with an emphasis on the experience of migrant communities in the U.S., Ecuador, and Spain. Dr. Masterson-Algar is a founding member of Somos Lawrence, an organization that advocates for effective, culturally informed outreach to Spanish-speaking residents of Douglas County. She's also directing the project We Are Lawrence, that's what Somos Lawrence means, but with Somos Lawrence is leading a project called We Are Lawrence, Celebrations of Remembrance and Growth, which received grant funding from the county program that Amy Vanderreed mentioned earlier. The grant will allow the project to host 2 community celebrations that stem from traditional festivities in Mexico and Central America. The Day of the Dead, which is a collective ritual of remembrance tied to the harvest, and Day of Spring, a celebration of the planting season. She's here today to share with us about that project.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much, and I got a little bit lost. That's why I landed and then landed, right? Directly, but I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank everyone that's here on Saturday morning, and particularly all the members of the Heritage Conservation Council of Douglas County for their support and enthusiasm towards this project that indeed does not quite fit into established definition of perhaps heritage. I'm also very thankful to the introduction because it allows me to move a little faster through the slides because I don't have to explain what Somos Lawrence is, and that allows me to focus a little more in how I was trying to convey the position or the way that I feel what heritage means through the lived experiences of communities that are on the move. So to change the slide, do I click? Is it here? Oh, perfect. Yes, so this project is in collaboration with the Ballard Center and also with Common Ground. And that's part of what is so exciting about these projects, is the amount of people that you meet and the networks that you build while working directly on the ground. How do I do that? There.
Next.
Just say next.
Oh, next. Okay. So we have been partnering, Somos Lawrence partnered with the Ballard Center since April of 2021, and that has allowed us to have a building, a space, and the benefit of the John Taylor Community Gardens immediately behind. So that opens venues for us to start doing small social gatherings to the different people that were coming to be served at Battered that were Spanish speaking, plus all the people that Somos Lawrence had been meeting and networking through the services we were providing before through hours in the library. It's the space in the public library, that's the space that we would use to just give referrals of different services that Douglas County has for residents that are for all residents, right, including those that don't speak English, but that often are unaware of the services available to them. So we started doing quite a bit of events of socialization and community building. And that's the next step has been, and there are some organizations that we have partnered with, that we have worked in translations, outreach, different ways of reaching and advocating to effectively access all the resources in Douglas County. Next. Okay. So there are the two events. The definition of heritage that we're using is of thinking that I want to advocate for is heritage as a means to work from our present towards collective futures. And in order to do that, the opportunity to gather as people in social spaces to share stories and to bring the stories we have to a specific piece of land too, right? Because gathering doesn't take place in the air, it takes place in specific locations, allows the opportunity to network, to feel part of the community that one perceives oneself to be part of, but also to extend the opportunities to the larger community. So the Day of the Dead, we have, these are the flyers of the two kind of seed events that we had for the events that we're planning for next year. We already had the celebration of the Day of the Dead last year. We did a smaller one than the one we're working towards. And we also did a celebration, just had the celebration of the Day of the Spring. Actually, we found out that the Day of the Spring is kind of too cold in Lawrence. So we're moving the Day of the Spring to the Day of the Child, which is another big celebration in it's the International Day of the Child. It has spring weather. It still allows to celebrate spring events and think of renewal. And the weather in Lawrence is a little more welcoming. So it takes place a little bit later. And then next. And both of these events are linked through some educational programs that I have also been working with through the community garden in a sweet potato program with the children at the Battered Center. So the Day of the Dead is tied to the harvest season, and the Day of the Spring is tied to the planting season. And we're thinking of that as very real and material metaphor to think of ourselves as part of communities, right? Planting and harvesting continuously. Yes, and we can do next. And next. So I'm going to be reading a little bit. I wanted to convey what it is that we are understanding as heritage. So we're understanding heritage not as something that is, but something that does. Essentially, heritage allows us to develop a sense of community and to understand our connection to others. It helps us perceive how we are tied to those who preceded us, but also to those around us in the present and to those who will follow. In that sense, heritage is not only the past that we claim as ours, but also the future that we inherit. Thus, we can only think of it in terms of its use. How it's used, not what it is. That is, in terms of what it does, not what it is. Our project stems from a shared sense of the urgency to provide venues to create spaces of conviviality and trust amongst newly arrived communities, and which are conducive to envisioning a shared future. We also understand heritage as part and parcel of everyday life, of the ways that we're living in the present. So it follows that heritage is in the quotidian and intrinsic to what we do every day. It works to develop our sense of who we are. It involves forms of learning wrapped in affect and emotions. So if we feel attached to a place, it's because we have been brought up through a series of practices, including where our family members take us on the weekend, where we go shop, with the stores that we go to, the places that we go to. So it involves forms of learning wrapped in affect. We choose which elements of our daily lives we make into our heritage, right? Which ones, based on which from our present we'd like to remember, And that is an individual and collective process, both come together. We also understand heritage as lived as quite different from heritage as institutionalized heritage, right? So lived heritage is lived and thus necessarily diffuse, plural, heterogeneous, polyphonic, and it follows partly exhibitable, right? It's very difficult to package and exhibit heritage, lived heritage. Myself, I am someone that is fascinated with spaces and with watching people in the street, watching people in their everyday life. So for me, often, activity around the museum is more interesting than what is inside the museum. Or at the very least, I'm interested in the continuities between what's outside the museum and what's inside it. Collective heritage from my work moves and circulates. Conversely, and someone by the name of Manuel Delgado, an anthropologist that I like very much, poses that the institutionalization of memory into heritage too often engages in a dual process of, and I don't know if these words are translatable, but musification and mummification, right? So how to maintain the lived palpitation of heritage in the process of sharing it is something that is very important, and I think it's something that museums and the efforts of sharing heritage are striving for continuously, or should strive for continuously. Too often these processes extend to spaces in the city, this idea of heritage that is institutionalized, right? Turning historical centers into empty shells for exhibition, right? Finished forms of nature where little life is there, other than for those that arrive, consume, and retrieve, right? Real estate interests play a key role also in the institutionalization of heritage, right? And we end up with crystallized memories often, and which the same anthropologists I was mentioning before, Manuel Delgado, notes end up selling su propia imagen convertida en caricatura, their own image turned into a caricature, a parody. Next. So I wanted to share a little bit the background that I bring to what I'm thinking now with the purposes that we're doing with Sumos Lawrence. And this is a very lived experience for me of how migrant communities often turn into heritage, and when they turn into heritage and culture, the institutionalized form, there's no longer people involved. In the case I worked in the Quad Cities, and here you have all the train yards that were tied to the Mexican communities, just like in Lawrence, La Yarda, etc. In the moment that they were building a high-speed train, all the area of a neighborhood that was neglected, but that was mainly inhabited by Mexican Americans and Mexican residents, that area became the Mexican neighborhood, and the neighbors had to leave. It became a space for people to consume, but no longer inhabited. You can change. Next. I'm almost there. One more. Next. Yes. And there you have different initiatives that opened, where you had the lived buildings of Las Americas, where so many stories of people were happening, where people had their daily heritage of walking to their store, going to their salon. Their stories turned into an avenue that you have right by it, right, planned by the city and all the stakeholders, right, where there was going to be a mercado, but where the local shops had to be closing one by one, right? So that is what we're trying to push against with some of the process of celebrating communities that are identified as migrants, but in their presence, right now, 50 years later. Next. There are a couple of examples of how heritage is conceived as our bodies, right? One of my students did that map of a human being with the railroad crossed, right, as a reaction to the maps that the city was doing to turn the neighborhood into heritage. And the next. And here is what often we miss, right? Here are events like the one we're planning for the Day of the Spring and the one we already celebrated, where in the minute you engage the people here, it's very messy, very handmade. As you see, we have a stone to hold the maps, right? But when the different neighbors started coming and putting pins on the spaces that they have affect networks to, the spaces where their lives have been built and are part of, you could see the very specific locations in Mexico of long past histories tied to the specific location of the Quad Cities, and then people identifying the specific neighborhoods within the Quad Cities, right? And the history of these three locations expands nearly over 100 years since the turn to the 20th since a turn to the 19th century. Yeah, so it wouldn't, and it's something these communities are perceived again and again as new, when really they're continuations of historical cycles that connect us to other places in ways that are often not recognized because it's difficult to build it as heritage. Right? And next. So this is the celebration that we did, the first one of the Day of the Dead, and I will close with a couple of thoughts in this one. So in the first celebration that we did in John Taylor Park, to honor the heritage of the Day of the Dead, that is a day of remembrance, it's tied to the harvest. We also work to honor communities of Lawrence outside of communities that are identified as being migrants, right? So in this case, we were honoring all the people that died in conditions of homelessness in Lawrence, and we partnered with different organizations and schools to engage the community in thinking about these human beings that have their histories and pass through us, right, and who rarely have the opportunity of being considered part of what makes us, right? Their contributions often unnoticed, and their histories so often erased or considered new every time. And the next, and I think I'm almost closing. Yeah, I just wanted to address that, of course, in this project we also have to think very carefully about the heritage of North Lawrence itself, and the place and the history of the Ballard Center as well. So all these histories kind of, are working together in ways that are beautiful and that generate a lot of opportunity, but also are necessarily tied to conflict and to ideas of who belongs and who doesn't. And that is part of heritage too, the conflicted part, the rubbing against each other, the figuring out whose heritage it is and for whom. And then I think I'm going to close with some just closing remarks. The last slide. So heritage initiatives have increasingly turned to Kansas Latinx histories, but these are mostly attentive to longer established communities who understand themselves as part and parcel of Kansas history. In Lawrence, we have the example of the efforts of descendants from La Yarda making a claim to that space as part of the heritage of Lawrence. But newly arrived migrants rarely perceive themselves as belonging to the communities where they live and work, and locals often do not consider newly arrived residents as the makers of a shared heritage. When those who live and work in a community perceive themselves as its members, everyone benefits. Our project stands on the belief that the migrant families that are currently making up our communities need not wait generations to understand themselves as actors in the unfolding of Douglas County's history. The labor of migrants, and specifically those marked by lower socioeconomic status and precarious labor conditions, often sets the grounds for other more representative or longer-standing populations to claim heritage. Our proposal stems from our understanding of heritage as part and parcel of our present. First-generation, low-income migrants, albeit socially and culturally marginalized, are key actors in the making of our shared history. And there you have a quote, again, from Manuel Delgado, where he speaks about this idea of integration, right? And the idea that migrants don't need to integrate to society, not to urban cultures, because they are simply part of their making. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. That was great. Next, we have Dr. Jay Johnson, who is the professor and associate chair in the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Science at KU. His research focuses on the survival of indigenous cultures, particularly in New Zealand, the Pacific, and North America. Dr. Johnson co-leads a project in Lawrence called Between a Rock and a Hard Place, which many of you are likely familiar. It's been in the paper quite a bit. Members of the Kaw Nation are working with Dr. Johnson and a team of people to lead the work to return in Juje Wahave, a 28-ton red Siouan quartzite boulder, which is currently located in Robinson Park in Lawrence, back to the Kaw Nation. The project also engages the community of Lawrence to explore the stories of Robinson Park, and as Dr. Masterson Algar spoke of, re-envision how we might interpret our heritage in that space.
Good morning. So I want to talk a little bit today about this project, the Ujuje Wahove, or Sacred Red Rock Project. Here represented on the screen are the rest of the leadership team, along with myself at the University of Kansas. We have Cindy Purcell, who's just joined the university at Spencer Museum of Art, who are one of our partners. We have Jim Pepper-Henry, who's the vice chair of Kaw Nation, and Pauline Sharp, both Kaw Nation citizens and representatives on our leadership team, as well as Tony Wheeler, city attorney for the city of Lawrence, and Dave Lowenstein, community muralist, artist, and organizer. Next, sorry, could you go back just for a second? I'm terrible about this. With funding from the Mellon Foundation, always very important. They've given us a very large grant, so I need to make sure that I've acknowledged them. Thank you. Next. So, Ujuje Wahove has traveled to Kansas several 100,000 years ago as a part of the last massive glaciation and its furthest extent coming down into northern Douglas County. Many of us who are long-term residents understand the impact of this glaciation on our landscape, the development of the Wakarusa and the Kansas rivers as a part of that process, and the transport of very large Siouan quartzite boulders into our landscape from many hundreds of miles to the north. Likely, Ujuje Wahove came from an area close to what is now Pipestone, Minnesota. And we planned a trip as a part of this project to try to find some of those locations and tell the longer story of Ujuje Wahove as well. Next slide. As the glaciers started to melt, first the Wakarusa was formed, and then later the Kaw River, and Ujuje Wahove was deposited as a part of that glacier melt at the confluence of Shenanganunga Creek and the Kansas River just outside of Tecumseh, Kansas. Next slide. The rock was a part of the Kansas people's prayer cycle. You'll see, hopefully it's maybe a little bit difficult to see, but number 11 up at the top of the prayer chart. And you'll also see that it is represented standing upright, and all stories that we have of the rock in its original location indicate that it was standing upright in the silty mud of the Kansas River. So the Kaw people had a very long history of recognizing the importance and sacredness of the rock to their tribe and incorporated it into their prayer cycle, their annual prayer cycle. Next slide. As settlers came into Kansas, they also recognized that the Ujuje Wahove, or the boulder, had some significance as well. And as the story is told, I'm still a little dubious about all the details of this story of the fight between Topeka and Lawrence to have the boulder in their city grounds as a part of memorialization. But evidently in September of 1929, there was some struggle between Topeka and Lawrence over the boulder. And as the story is told, although I don't believe any bit of this, Lawrence residents went out and absconded the boulder in the dead of night using a Santa Fe railroad crane to get it out of the river. I believe that part of the story, that it happened in the dead of night and was all a secret process. That's the part that I'm a little dubious about. It's a very large rock, and I can't imagine that happening in the dead of night. But the boulder ended up being transferred to Lawrence in 1929. Next slide, please. And here is our only picture of the rock before it was mounted into the base that it's contained in now in Robinson Park. So a lot of interest about how much is actually in the base and contained within it, and how much it will actually weigh once it's we start the process to move it. But here it is on that infamous rail car being moved into downtown Lawrence. Next slide. And here it is erected for the October 1929 commemoration of the founding of Lawrence, with representatives, likely all who were descendants of the original founders, represented on the plaque. Next slide. Here's a portion of the plaque, and if you visited the park and read the plaque, there's a great deal of memorialization of the abolitionist founding of Lawrence, and those founders are listed below the portion shown here, and founding this state in righteousness is one of the famous lines from the plaque. Next slide. So the Between the Rock and a Hard Place project started between Dave Lowenstein and Pauline Sharp, who was part of the current leadership team, who started discussions about the rock as a part of Dave Lowenstein's Kansas People's History project back in 2015. As they discussed the project and started doing their own research into the history, trying to uncover information in the archives, they decided to put in an application in late 2018, I believe it was, for funding from the Mid-America Alliance for the Arts, money coming from the Mellon Foundation. And this small seed grant allowed for a group of us to come together and start really working on the project. Some of you may have attended the handful of sessions that we had before the pandemic. Had great sessions. The pandemic came and really slowed our progress, as it did for many other projects happening across the globe. And so we had to move a lot of that discussion online at that point. But all of that discussion really indicated that there was a lot of sentiment in Lawrence that the rock should be returned to the Kaw Nation if they wish to make that request. Some discussion about the future of the plaque as well, and I will note that we have plans in our project and funding to recreate the plaque if it cannot be safely removed from the rock without causing more damage. So we'll see how this all plays out over the next 12 to 16 months. But in any case, next slide. Yeah, there we go. Kaw Nation did decide in General Council to ask for the return of the rock in late 2020. And here is the banner headline from the Journal World of that request being made. Next slide. And the city voted just a few months later to return the rock. It was a unanimous vote of the city commission. And I think notably, as a part of that, it wasn't just the vote. They also agreed and issued a formal apology to the tribe, because it's very well documented that people knew this had significance to the tribe at the time. It was taken from the river and relocated and turned into a monument. Next slide. So we began the process then of trying to understand the rock's current situation. Geologists from the University of Kansas were brought in, experts in this kind of quartzite, and we started to realize that there, as it is set here in the park, we weren't entirely clear whether some of the cracks on the surface had become more serious cracks that might jeopardize moving the rock. So here pictured is Professor Andreas Muller from the geology department, doing a ground-penetrating radar assessment of the rock, and very pleased to be able to announce that it is in sound shape and is ready to be moved once we pull all of the other components of such a move together. So, next slide. And its final location, as decided upon by the Kaw Nation General Council, is to their last reservation lands just outside of Council Grove at Alohawayo Memorial Park, about 160 acres that the tribe currently owns there in Morris County. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Finally, we have Dr. Kelly Kincher, who's a senior scientist and professor at the Kansas Biological Survey and Center for Ecological Research. Kelly is best known as a passionate advocate for native plants, native landscapes, and wild places. His research focuses on native prairies, prairie plants, and plant communities. He's a conservationist, teacher, mentor, and environmental problem solver, and the author of books on edible and medicinal plants. Kelly is here today as a co-founder of the Kansas Land Trust, which protects and preserves lands of ecological, agricultural, scenic, historic, and/or recreational significance in Kansas. The Kansas Land Trust, or KLT's, mission is to preserve both agricultural and natural landscapes across Kansas, and they've preserved over 40,000 acres across 78 properties in Kansas.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. I'm really appreciative of the Heritage Conservation Council, which has funded several projects I've been involved in or collaborated on. Kind of my pitch in expanding our thoughts about our heritage is, I guess I'm going to speak here for the wild, or speak for native plant communities. This slide you're looking at is actually taken from the air just north of here, like a mile or two north from here, looking north across what we call Baldwin Woods. This is the largest remaining natural tract in Douglas County, meaning this is the largest tract of land that has been not substantially altered since European settlement. We need to think about properties like this as an important part of our cultural heritage. And it's taken a lot of work to even see this parcel protected, much of which is owned by the University of Kansas, but there's also private properties. One of those private properties has a Heritage Conservation Council easement that was funded. Another property has had other federal money used in purchase of it. So there's been a lot of collaborative effort in getting this tract protected. Next slide, please. And of course, the county was very, very different. This is the University of Kansas looking from the river at Mount Oriat in 1867, I believe. And most people don't realize this, but the campus was prairie. Was not forested or wooded, but very, very open. There's one building on top of Mount Oriat at that time. Next slide, please. And most of the county was indeed prairie, and I'll show a slide, but 85% of Douglas County, we believe, was prairie at the time of settlement. So we're really in a prairie country, and most of us living here today have great appreciation of trees and forests, and yet our heritage and really our remnants of natural wildness are on prairie tracts. Next slide, please. So why protect prairies and protect natural areas? Well, they are an important part of our cultural heritage. They provide context for all the cultural history we're talking about. If you think about it, all the things that have transpired here in the last 200 years longer are based on that natural heritage to begin with. And of course, these tracts aren't just about plants and plant species and habitats. They're really all about biodiversity. And we're not even fully aware of that biodiversity. We're still learning things, we're still watching things, and we're vaguely aware of changes, but it's imperceptible to most of us when we don't really document it or can document it that well. For instance, no one's talking about this really, and we should. Prairie chickens, which have been part of our county, have gone extinct probably in the last 10 to 15 years. We've now reduced the prairie cover and grassland habitat so much that species does not find our local environments suitable habitat. We should give consideration to that. We're now much more concerned about pollinators, which is great. We still don't have a good handle on all the pollinators and their populations. So we have a lot to learn. So there's a lot of unusual species here. The lower right's a regal fritillary. It's a butterfly that's been considered for protection. We only find those on really high-quality prairies full of wildflowers in our county. We probably have 50 locations left where we find this butterfly in the county. We don't give much concern to these things, and we should. Next slide, please. So I've had the opportunity to do survey work through the Kansas Biological Survey to help identify the natural areas remaining in Douglas County. Most of the remaining natural areas, native prairies, forests, wetlands, the ones that are high quality, meaning they still have the majority of the original characteristics in terms of species present, habitat, most of those tracts are private property. So most of those tracts are protected because people have decided to keep them in that fashion. But Douglas County is rapidly changing. Land ownership is rapidly changing. Long-term farm families are retiring, and often there's kids that are not coming up through the ranks to continue that farm. So we're seeing lots of transitions, and things that really affect our landscape are happening. I'm very concerned about the new leg of the South Lawrence Trafficway around Lawrence, because that is opening up all that area to the west to really be development for housing that will probably serve more of Topeka and Johnson County in terms of people living there. There'll be Lawrence residents, but there'll be part of that road access really creates development. And another one's just come up recently are the solar farms. The solar farms will greatly impact any of our natural habitats. Prairies with solar panels on top of them will probably be degraded pretty quickly. Next slide, please. One iconic species, we have two iconic plant species in the county that are protected, at least protected from federal issues. Most people don't realize this endangered species, especially plants, a landowner can plow them up, can get rid of them, can spray them. That's not illegal. The Endangered Species Act only protects against federal action. You can't build the traffic way across and get rid of endangered species unless you mitigate for that. They'll probably let you get rid of that habitat if you agree to move species or plant them elsewhere. Endangered Species Act really is not all that strong locally. Has bigger impacts on a larger scale, but locally for individual tracts it's not that effective. This plant, Mead's milkweed, it's not very showy, it's not pretty, it's not really a wildflower, and it's a milkweed. Kind of hard to advocate for weeds, but I do a lot of that. It is only in about 30-some tracts left in Douglas County. We only find it on the very best of our native prairie sites. Those are actually managed as hay fields, cut for hay once a year. That's the only place we find it. Any grazing land, it's just too sensitive, it disappears, does not come back. On places that have been cropped or farmed, doesn't like forest, it needs full light. It's not very successful, doesn't make very many seeds. Most plants don't even make seed in any given year. It's a long-lived perennial, and it's slowly winking out. We've established a little bit at KE land, but it's hard to restore. So we really need to protect those remaining sites. I'm really pleased to work with the Kansas Land Trust. I've been a founding member, and I'm pleased to say that we've protected 4 populations in Douglas County on private property using conservation easements. Conservation easements allow a landowner, of course, to own their land, use it, and then also conserve it, meaning that we can lock in that existing land use, so a prairie will stay as a prairie. Next slide, please. This is the map showing the prairie and forest. A little hard to see, but the red areas encircle areas that were forested in 1856. And that's our earliest historic records of what the landscape looked like. And so you only had forests along the rivers, but not the whole floodplain, and on steep hills. The biggest circle on the lower right is Baldwin Woods, which I showed you the slide of, and yet not all of it's forested today. Next slide, please. These are remaining natural areas. These are high-quality tracts of prairie or forest. The green blobs are the forests, which we have more of that left, than prairies, which are little orange pieces. Most of the map is white, not surprising. We have tremendous amounts of cropland and other land uses in the county. And most of those dots are unprotected. And that's why I'm a strong advocate for Douglas County needs to create a natural areas program, an open space program, whatever you want to call it, but get involved with protecting these remaining tracts, figuring out ways using conservation easements or purchase where that's appropriate, of course working with landowners, doing this in a way that we work on this over time. You have to be ahead of the cycle. If the solar farm is out there and they're paying big bucks for leases, those lands are getting used up, you know. So we need that program. We need deal makers to help protect things. Next slide. So less than 0.5% of Douglas County prairie remains, and we continue to lose it. We've done inventory work more than once, and we're losing about 20% every decade. So it's slowly dripping away. Next slide. The green here is the forested areas. So we have a lot of what appear to be natural areas. They're forests, and that's nice to have, and that's good open space. We need to protect some of that too. That is habitat, but it's lower quality habitat. Next slide. Forests don't just have trees, they have wonderful wildflowers. And my pitch to you today is most of our high-quality natural areas are full of wildflowers. Next slide, please. Most of the landscape looks like this, with very little natural left. Next slide, please. So we had a comprehensive plan for the county. There's great support for protecting these areas. People want to see green space, open space. They want to see our biodiversity protected. We need to get some funding in a program. That's what we need. That's the next step. Next slide, please. So these great interest in these open space, preserving buildings, of course, is high, managing future growth. All these things fit together, and we can work on all of them together. Next slide. And so we've looked at these areas, and mainly what we're proposing, and I think I'll end with this slide, is really what we need is we need a program that looks at combining these things, looks at actually combining all the facets we're talking about on this panel and others. Why not protect Santa Fe trail ruts, historic sites, a prairie or a piece of forest? Why not have bike routes, hiking trails that connect these sites, become usable, working with private property owners, getting easements, maybe for trail rights in some cases, protecting land in others. But in all this, we need an effort to really do this, and really now is the time, with all the things upon us, with the opportunity, with having a program already, the Heritage Conservation Commission, to help initiate this and get this going. So with that, I'd like to say, I think we still have a lot of wild spaces left, a lot of opportunity in this county. With COVID, more people than ever are accessing our natural areas, our trails, needing to get out, wanting to connect to nature. So now's the time. Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. Caitlin, are we okay if we go a few minutes over since we started a couple minutes late? Okay. I have a question for the whole panel, and then I hope to open it up to the audience. I hope you all have good questions too. If you do have questions, could you line up in a few minutes by the stairs and come up to the podium to ask so that people can hear you? Oh, you do? Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Amy. So Dr. Masterson Aller mentioned that we have traditionally thought of preservation as kind of institutional heritage, protecting tangible things like buildings, objects, and it's focused on the history of specific groups of people, like European settlers or colonizers. How do you each envision the future of heritage? What would that look like if you could, in your dreams, what would that connection be between people and places and kind of a more living vision of heritage?
You're all okay. I'll look at this. Well, as I was thinking of listening to the various presentations and thinking of this coming together of land, the built environment, and then people doing things across times and space, I think, and I think in a way I should say that a lot of institutional heritage is pushing against the boxing of, and we are an example, actually, of that. The work that the Commission did is an example of that, supporting this, right? But I think it is the awareness of how those levels come together. So as I was listening, being aware as you're walking, for instance, the Santa Fe Trail, that in addition to being a historical route tied to commerce and to the building of an economy and of a political space, an economic space, that it's also tied to changes in land as people have been moving, that it is also tied to those people, all the people that made it, instead of just thinking of it as the end product. So I think for me, the idea of heritage would be almost like like we're being able to perceive it as an ecosystem that crosses through layers of time and space, and that really connect everyone in a way that is redemptive at times, but also full of conflict as well, and to be able to embrace both, and to be able to see it as continuously unfinished also.
One short thought. You know, the concept of biodiversity is relatively new. As you know, scientist, I didn't know that word when I started my career. And just hearing this thing about this, really now we're talking even something broader, bioculturally diverse. We don't have good language for this. It means it's not been in our realm. And we need to develop that language. I mean, because I think that's how we develop these connections and actually make things happen.
One quick comment on this. I believe that the memorialization that we see here in Douglas County and across the country has tended to tell only partial stories and partial histories. And I think moving forward here in Lawrence and Douglas County, that we need to tell a broader cross-section of the histories and the stories of our residents. And I definitely see that happening across the United States and even globally.
Can I add one thing? Also thinking, and there is not a shortage of initiatives in that, but also thinking of spaces as tied to larger processes. So thinking of spaces as not just the space, but the sounds that are involved in it, the smells that are involved in that space, and tying a little bit more the lived memories to that heritage that then we're able to consume or practice, so that they echo more in a larger number of people, right? So people feel that indeed it is a space where they feel they have a connection that allows them to think about their futures, their present, and how they imagined their past.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? I have lots of questions, so I can keep asking. Okay, I have specific questions for each of you. Kelly, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you may have learned from stewardship of past peoples who have lived in Douglas County. I think Christina mentioned a few of them, the Kickapoo, the Sioux, the Osage, people who have lived on this land. How do they care for the prairie, and what can we learn about that today?
You know, much of my research work is I wear the hat as an ethnobotanist, so I'm very interested in cultural use of plants, edible medicinal plants, and so in doing that, I've worked with and I've studied the history of Native Americans' use of plants and then landscape. And of course, you're talking about people who had oral histories and oral ways of doing things, and yet you keep running into these things that we all know prairie fires were an important part of our landscape. What people don't know is that most prairie fires were set by humans. And some of those were managed, some of those were, we've always had kids who played with fire and it gets away. We've always had people who aren't careful with fire. But a lot of that fire was managed. And so there's management. We're seeing in other parts of the country where Native folks are working with the Forest Service, working with others on management. There's a concept of traditional ecological knowledge that's well embodied in Native people's use of lands and landscape. And so there's tremendous opportunities for us to get these dialogues going and talking about collaborative management and talking about ways of management used in the past that would still be very effective today.
Thank you. Jay, in your work to return the sacred red rock to the Kaw Nation, what lessons can you share with us about starting to repair some of the harms that have been done in the past by preservation, and maybe having some of those dialogues that Kelly's talking about, making a more inclusive heritage moving forward?
Well, certainly we started, not really, I shouldn't say we started in 2020, but the social movements of 2020 in the midst of the pandemic really brought a lot of attention onto the memorial landscape of the United States. And I think we're very lucky as a nation that the Mellon Foundation decided to contribute $250 million toward an inventory and rectifying and engaging with how memorialization is happening and how we are responding to our historical memorial landscape. So I'm heartened by that. I'm very excited to see where that's going to lead us as a country and our county, and as we start to engage in that national dialogue as well.
And then, Araceli, you said something that I thought was interesting, which is heritage bringing forth a kind of complex, almost ecosystem type heritage that might have some conflict, like we see in actual ecosystems. It's not always peaceful. Can you talk a little bit more about what that might look like, the kind of the future of heritage, but how we navigate some of those conflicts and people are still willing to participate, even though it's hard and difficult sometimes?
I think I can think of a couple of examples, and what I was thinking now, actually, with your presentations, because oftentimes what happens with recently arrived migrants, right, or people that are identified as recently arrived migrants, is that they get folded often into other communities, or they become invisible, or they're perpetually new, right? So, in a way, in the context of the US, or in the context of Lawrence more specifically even, I was addressing how the situation, for example, of La Llanta, right? And many of you have been exposed to the efforts that the descendants of La Llanta have been doing to claim the space, right? To make it a space of memory and heritage. I think, and in the film that was recently made, that was very well put together, right? The people that are being interviewed are addressing the social difficulties that they were having to actually integrate, right? The fact that they were in that space for a very specific reason, right? That they were underpaid workers that were living in a space that ended up flooded in 1951. A lot of spaces got flooded in 1951, right? But spaces that are put in precarious positions, places that are not suitable to good living, right? How those are the places where these communities ended up being, right? So as they were making the effort to be able to make it a park, it was very interesting to me to see the responses from the city explaining, well, the train runs through it, so it's kind of dangerous. And the river is right by it, so it's kind of dangerous. You know, and in my mind, I was thinking, well, precisely, right? Because it is a dangerous, horrible spot. And this is why this community was put there, right? So how do we reconcile addressing that, right? How is this community able to have a space that they can claim as part of their heritage, right? That is in such a precarious position in space, right? That is actually now a location where many people that are unhoused are camping, right? And to me, these social processes are really interesting because in my mind, if the people that are right now camping there are removed to build a memorial to La Yarda, in my mind, the unhoused communities that occupied that space should have a little line as well. You know, as someone that was occupying that space, it didn't close, it didn't stay empty. It was a space that other communities that are pushed aside occupied in situations of precarity too. So those are some questions that I think, and the other example that I was thinking was with the genealogies of Mexican ties, of ties between what today is Kansas and what today is Mexico, right? Or these continued histories between these territories, and how it was way before the railroad, the railing of the cows, the driving the cattle, right? The cattle drivers were actually, you know, they would come to Kansas and they were bringing the cattle up to Kansas. This is part of the heritage, but is also a tremendously damaging part of the heritage, right? Because cattle has caused tremendous damage in many ways, but it is also part of the heritage and part of what people are and become. So I think being okay with all these contradictions are some, and in that heritage, you know, when we think of cowboys or we think of cattle, we think of barbecue, rarely does the connections to Mexican histories come through. And in my mind, it's very important that they should, because that is the only means for communities to not be perceived as eternally new or as eternally marked as something, right? Something that is part but not right?
You make me think, and just to chime in, really most of our heritage protection has conflicts inherent in it. I think of the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, which you maybe think about when that was established. We really needed a unit in the national park that would protect prairie and honor prairie. But to cut that deal, the language, the enabling language, says there has to be interpretation of the Flint Hills ranching culture. That has to be part of that park. And that means there's cattle there in part. And there's really not enough acreage for a really great bison herd. It's a bison herd managed as if they were cattle in many respects. Protecting land in Douglas County, private property rights. Got to be careful about that, right? That's threatening. Even a program is threatening, right? Because of private property rights. I mean, just the situation that Jay, you're involved in. We're changing the cultural history. We're going to remove a plaque. I mean, you know, there's conflict in all of these. But I think that's why we're much better now at a lot of public dialogue. We're going to announce this thing, a long planning term, planning sessions, let the public speak, hear these issues that people might have. Seems to be all that's important.
Yes, please.
Okay, make sure I get my mouth to do this right. I've got a lot of questions and a lot of comments I'd like to make. I really don't know how to structure it in this kind of environment. I thought we were going to be one-on-one with each one of these speakers. I'm a member of the Osage and Kansa tribes. I've spent the last probably 30 years of my life very active as a dual citizen, with both my tribal nations being able to vote and represent myself in both cultures. Not a very popular thing with either tribe at this time. I grew up with more than 12 tribal nations across more than 7 states. Many in the Northwest, growing up with migrant people, working my first jobs. My mother's culture contributed to what I look like today, not my father's. My early ancestors were all migrants. German, and Scots-Irish. They didn't want to be a part of the larger culture, yet they did. And today it's hard to see the blending of cultures in me. If I didn't tell you I was Osage and Kansa, you'd never know. Indians have a word for that, pass. I can pass. Many tribal people pass because they don't want to be discriminated against. That happened during the Osage murders back in the 20s. With all my involvement with my tribe, I've never heard anything about this rock in my entire life. Any of the stories that my family told, any of the tribal council meetings that I went to, nothing ever surfaced on this rock. Yet I run an educational facility with cooperation from the Department of Tourism, Agriculture, Forestry, Commerce and Arts for the state of Kansas, in Paxico, Kansas. I'm surrounded by ancestral villages all around me of the Kansa Nation, to which they've refused to take ownership and stewardship of when the land and the sites have been identified and donated to them free of charge, just to conserve those sites, and they've refused to do so. Charles Curtis, if those of you who know who Charles Curtis is a great uncle of mine. I've worked with the people that have restored his home, and now their daughter that has control of his estate there in Topeka. That home was donated to the Kaw tribe. They refused. And yet they want to cry crocodile tears over this rock. If that rock is sacred, where did God leave that rock? God left it in the river. Moving it to Council Grove is not going to restore the Creator's connection to that rock. It's going to create a commercial income for them with their event down in Council Grove. If that rock is sacred, it should be returned to where God left it. That's my concern about that rock. Migrant communities. I'm a product of migrant communities. Living on reservations. Well, let me do this and then I'll give it up. Indian reservations represent migrant communities. My ancestors were all about assimilation and not reservation. And I think that's where we need to go.
Thank you for that. Any final comments from the panel or responses? Really appreciate you sharing that with us, and maybe during the coffee break there's time for a bit more dialogue about that. Thank you everybody for coming. Caitlin, what time do we reconvene? 11:15? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you everyone. There's refreshments in the reception area. Thank you so much to the panel.
Sorry, I'm also super loud. You're also welcome to, during the break, talk to anyone one-on-one as well, and during lunchtime, one-on-one talks. I just want to remind you that Carl Ramberg is doing some stone carving demonstration in the Ebright courtyard. It's just around past the bathroom, and he's an amazing stone carver, and it's worthwhile to go see him work, because this is probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see him do this. All right, thank you.